from 3:15 to 4:15. So we're up to 60 people. Again, thank you everyone for coming this evening. We have a great guest speaker for you, Dr. Rijal. He's an entomologist, and he is going to talk about integrated pest management. And for some people, that's a new term, but it is a term that has been around for quite a while. And he's going to introduce that and some ideas of implementing IPM into managing pests in the nut crops of California. And if we look around our area, we all know that this is an area that economically and agriculturally, we rely heavily upon our nut crops that we have. And so he's going to share some ideas and some concepts, you know, that could put some changes into what we see going on around the valley. And so with that, I want to obviously thank Dr. Rijal and introduce Dr. Rijal to you all this evening. And here he is. He is going to do a question and answer with you this evening. And I think Liz is going to kind of watch that in the chat area, and she will pass the questions on at the end. So I think he's going to talk for about 30 to 40 minutes, and then he'll have about 10 minutes of question and answer at the end. So again, thank you once again for joining us this evening. And here is Dr. Rijal.
Okay, good afternoon. My voice is okay? You can hear okay? I just wanted to check it. Okay, sounds good. Yeah, so my name is Rijal. I work with University of California Cooperative Extension. I work locally here in Modesto area, Northern San Joaquin Valley, as an area IPM advisor. So my specialty in insect entomologist by training. In addition to doing the local area IPM advisor, helping pest control advisors and growers in the area, I also had some responsibility with the statewide IPM program as an associate director for agriculture IPM. So you see statewide IPM program is under the University of California Agriculture and Natural Resources, and this is the program that provides a lot of science-based information that we use routinely in ag, and then also the urban area also about, you know, how to manage pests and what are the different aspects of the pest management, and that kind of information. And pest management guidelines are the big thing in California. So so that's my little bit of background. So and for today's talk, I'm thinking I could focus a little bit about what is IPM in general. I know that some of you all already know about, you know, the IPM and implementing IPM practices and things, but others may not know quite about what the IPM means in general. So I'll cover that part a little bit, and then later half of my talk, a little more than that, would be about how we can potentially implement, or how we're implementing the IPM program in one of the kind of major insect pest of nut crops that we deal with, or the growers and PCA are dealing with a routine basis in California. So I'll talk about kind of giving an example of implementation of IPM using that insect. So again, thanks again for joining my seminar today. I really appreciate your attention and then participated on this seminar. And also, I would like to say I'd like to thank the organizer for this seminar, inviting me for this presentation. Okay, so next I want to talk about, let's focus on what is IPM. Since I talked about, you know, even my title, it's an area IPM advisor, but it is important to know what is IPM. We just generally refer IPM as, you know, the pest management, pest control in different ways. But what is, if we understand systematically, what is IPM? Let me see what it gives me. Okay. So the IPM, if we go the definition of IPM that UC IPM put out, as you see here in this one, it's really an ecosystem-based strategy that focuses on a long-term prevention of the pest or the damage, and a combination of the techniques such as various different tactics that we have to control the pest that include biological, habitat manipulation, and different kinds together. And also the other thing that IPM includes is pesticide, the insecticide or pesticide in general are also the part of the IPM program, but we wanted to use it only after the monitoring, insect pest monitoring indicates that we need the pesticide to use. And follow that guidelines to use the pesticide. And the ultimate goal of this is to minimize the risk to the human health, beneficial organism, non-targets, and then to the environment. So as you see, it's a long definition, but covers whole aspect of the various things that are under the IPM. If you look at kind of certain version of the IPM definition wise, it is also, you can also consider this is as a decision-based pest management process that involves the coordinated use of multiple tactics to optimize the pest control measures of basically focusing on all classes of pest in an ecologically and economically sound manner. So a few things here. One is IPM is not a one method of insect control. It's kind of decision-making process when you make a plan for managing certain pest or the different pests together in your crop. It's whether it's on the field crop or the nut crops or any other crop. So it's a sort of decision-making process that is basically come based on your the various tactics that you combine together. And also look at the goal. Goal is optimizing the control. It's not about eradicating of the pest, or it's not about killing everything out there. It's more about how we can optimize or manage that pest so that we can get both ecologically balanced environment, as at the same time we also have to get the economic returns. This is a definition that by RJ Proxy. He's an entomologist. He worked on a lot of aspects of pest management and IPM. So what that really means for the practitioner, for the IPM practitioner like myself, and then the other pest control advisor and consultant who are working out there in the field, what that means. That means is that we, in order to manage any certain pest or the system, multiple pests within the system, we need to first know the problem. What are the pests out there? What's its biology? Understanding its ecology is very important for sustain. And if we know the pest, then we need to have tools to monitor this pest. And then also not only the pest, but also its natural enemies, predators, parasites. Those is part of the IPM. And if we have those, we can also develop the economic threshold. So not all level of pest or the damage needs treatment of any kind. So we need to come up with those economic treatments or the threshold values that we can base upon, we can use as a basis to make any kind of pest control decision. And the last one is basically integrating these all tools, both preventative as well as multiple pest control tactics together to achieve effective pest management. What's the ultimate goal? Ultimate goal of the IPM is always, it needs to have the economics component in it. It needs to provide the long-term economic benefit or savings to the user, to the grower in this case. Also, the goal is to reduce the pesticide use if possible, and also protect both environment as well as human health. So these are the principles of the IPM as I listed, and I'll talk a little more about here also. So, and sometimes when I talk IPM, I like to add analogy here, like build a building. So IPM building is something that, as you see in the building, that all the components needs to be there in order to have a strong building, right? For example, in IPM building, we need to have the strong foundation. So those are the ones that I already mentioned. For example, knowing the pest, its biology, ecology, and then also the knowing whether there is any monitoring tools available. What is the sampling strategy? What's the population level? Are you seeing any damage? And if we see, what time? Those kind of all the factors together puts as a foundation of IPM program. And if you looked at in the building, the pillars are the major part of the building that gives the strength to the building. And so these are our control methods or the tactics, whether it's a preventative or the control measures that we implement after we see any pest out there in the field. So where the IPM concept came from, I'll just talk briefly about this because it's important to kind of understand why and why we're implementing the IPM. So the IPM actually, it's not exactly IPM, but it's about, when 1940s, when we have the DDT and the organic chlorine based pesticide is developed and or invented. At that time, there was a lot of use of DDT in multiple sectors. Mostly at that time, it was in the World War, killing lice and killing, mosquito for preventing those malaria infecting our troops and out in the field and those kind of things. And it has a lot of use in multiple occasions, even the household use in different control methods in urban and then also in the ag and later. And so the Rijal Carson is the one that kind of started thinking about, I mean, if we're using this DDT this way, there might have some negative impact. So we need to kind of think about it. And she's the kind of the person that creates awareness at that time. And then she also published a great book. It's called The Silent Spring. It's a really, really a nice book to look at. So she's a kind of initiator in this area. But what happens to the ag? So when we start using the DDT, organic chlorine, chlordane, and other organic chlorine in the ag, also have the same thing because it's a broad spectrum insecticide. It kills, a lot of insect and natural enemies in there. And then so in the ag environment, there are California scientists that are engaged at that time to think about how we can potentially use these kind of pesticide, but at the same time responsibly, because as the IPM principle says that not every level of pest infestation or the damage requires to use of the insecticide. So they come up with the idea. Here is the picture of the scientist on the very right. As you see, Dr. Stern, Vernon Stern. He was a UC Riverside entomologist professor at the time. And so he and colleague, they published a paper. And as you see in Hilgardia, so this is the idea about how we can effectively use this chemical insecticide, but at the same time, we need to protect the environment as well as other beneficial insects, which are also benefit our agricultural production system. So they come up with this concept, as you see on the left here, working on an insect called the spotted alfalfa aphid. They come up with this idea, different terms here, as you see in this graph. So what this graph tells us is that in the y-axis, you see the number of the insect or the number of the injury equivalent. So it's essentially density of the insect or pest present in that particular crop. And on here, you can see different levels. Sorry about that. Different levels. So for example, you can see certain level of the pest, even though they are there, they are present, they are feeding on these different things. In this case, on the leaf, spotted alfalfa aphid, and the certain level of the pest, even though they are there, they are present, they don't do any kind of crop loss or yield loss. That is on the bottom of this picture, as you see here. So this area, even though they are there, it doesn't do any economic loss, any loss. In that regard. If the certain level of the population increase to a certain extent, then you still use, you see the loss, but it's not going to be economic. So in other words, if even though you see the loss, and if you use the insecticide, you still need to pay for that insecticide and application and that part. If you put those all together, it's not going to be economically beneficial to use the insecticide. That part is non-economic losses, as you see in the middle. On the top, you see the economic losses, where you can see when the pest infestation reached that economic injury level on here on this level. After that point, then you need to think about how to manage this pest, because if you go beyond that point, you will get the economic loss. That's a concept of this. So this concept helps a lot in terms of how we can keep this population below that economic injury level and potentially don't have to, use insecticide. If we still have to use the insecticide, why not we wait until, the population level reach certain level, and then you can use it. At the same time, also the people researcher at that time, and then also the people involved on ag and pest management industry and business start using the term called management instead of using control. We still use the term control, but in terms of IPM principle, you're managing the pest rather than you're controlling the pest. Control is something that, well, if you see there, you need to kill them. Versus, management is something that you need to think about holistic approach. What are the, other factors involved in it? How you will be potentially reduce this pest problem without going directly into spraying. Is there any beneficial insect that are playing into role to keep the population below, even though you're seeing these pests out there? So these are all the factors there. That's why we like to use the term more management instead of control. And so I explained that there are a lot of different, and density of the insect that we think about, we need to watch out. So in that case, what are the other things that we could do to measure that? How we can measure the density of the insect or the number of the insect particularly there, so that we know that we're reaching that economic threshold or not. So I'll talk a little more about that aspect from now. Okay, a little bit of diverted topic, but it's related ultimately, I'll promise you. So when we talk about insect monitoring, we need to think about how we can monitor, right? So one of the good example, one of the kind of routine use of these monitoring tools that we're using is based on different kinds of attractant, whether we use the pheromone attractant or other kinds of attractant that we attract the insect to the trap, so that we know that insect, when the insect initiate, what's the population or the number look like, and where and when I need to intervene if I need to. So that term, it's kind of fancy term. It's a Greek word, semeion. It's called semiochemicals. That this is a part of that, as you see in here. So pheromone is one of the semiochemicals. Semiochemical is the chemical that has the message. So in other words, the chemical that is produced by the insect or any other organism, it produces the signal and it triggers any activity on the other animal. That is, in general, it's a semiochemical, has a signal in it. So the pheromone is one of them. The pheromone, particularly, we technically, it's the chemical signal or the substance that's secreted by an animal, in this case insect, to the outside, that affect the behavior or physiology of the other insect of the same species. So again, it's intra-species. So within the same species, for example, if we talk about navel orangeworm or the peace twig borer, so anything that one male or the female produce influence the male or female of the same species, that we categorize under the pheromone. If we have the various different allochemicals, they are also the part of these kind of communication, but these are the between species. For example, if if insect can signal from the plant or the flower and those kind of things goes into that interspecific on the right hand side. And we use one of them is Pheromone. Pheromone is the one that we use in regular basis in pest monitoring. Pheromone is the compound that is produced by the one species and utilized to get the signal by the another species, not within the same species, but by the different species, and they are attracted to there or repelled by there. And in this case, the one that is attracted to that volatile or that communication is benefited. That's what these different terms comes in. So maybe it's a little confusing, but I think the pheromone and pheromone, these are the ones that we use in routine basis in many different pest control practices in terms of monitoring. Okay, so what are the tools out there? So as I explained, the pheromone trap is pretty common in across the several different species of the insect. For example, you see some of the example of these. These are the trap type. It doesn't necessarily the attractant. We can use different kinds of attractant in these traps. These traps are actually the device that has attractant in it most of the time. For example, if this is a delta trap and this is a lure that is a female based pheromone in it, so that male moth will be attracted and then trapped in there. Same thing this one, but the trap design is different, and then we use the different kinds of design based on the species, based on the strength of these attractant that you're using. Also, sometime whether we'll be able to visit to the orchard regular basis in every few days or 7 days, or we can only go in every 2 weeks interval or so. It also depends on the insect species, how serious that pest is. You need to go every 5 days or 7 days, or you can wait another week. Depends on that. We can use different kinds of trap. For example, bucket trap, if you put out there, you can, if you don't need to go for every week, then you can put that out there. So there will be a lot of the moth or the insect collected on there. You don't need to change regularly, for example. If you use the delta trap and if you don't go there in the peak season for 2 weeks, then these sticky traps is probably already saturated. There are also new kinds of traps that you see on the bottom middle, the Semios trap. They are different camera-based trap, and a lot of new technology, precision agriculture, remote based kind of traps, and the devices are also coming up in the market. So in a sense that we're using the pheromone trap in quite commonly in many insects. We also use regularly for the smaller insect, we use these yellow sticky traps for the aphid and whitefly and then thrips and those kind of smaller insect in general. And these can be used with or without attractants or any additional attractants. In many cases, the yellow sticky card itself is attractant. So these are also kind of some of the example. We use some of not only the pheromone that I mentioned there as a sex pheromone, but also the other kinds of pheromone. For example, aggregation pheromone that insect produce. Sometimes we also utilize those pheromone and attract the insect. For example, this is an insect that we relatively recently, a few years ago, we start finding in the northern San Joaquin Valley. It's an invasive pest called the brown marmorated stinkbug. I've been working on this pest past 4 or 5 years. So for this insect, we use this black pyramid trap that goes on the ground, and we use the lure that is aggregation pheromone-based lure on the top of that container. If you see that black pyramid type of trap there. So the idea for this one, this will attract both adults flying in as well as the nymph. They can crawl up on that trap and then go get into the trap on that container. So it depends on the purpose of what you are trying to accomplish and what species and what's out there available, those kind of things. The other thing concept that I want to include here is that in the insect monitoring is that the degree day concept. So I'm not going to talk too much about this here, but in general, insect their reproduction, their activity is highly dependent on temperature and the heat, that heat units in what accumulated. So the degree day concept of degree days is that if we say that day by day, 5 days or 7 days and like that from certain point, that would be good for us. But for the insect, if you have, maximum 75-degree temperature in 5 days versus if you have maximum 95-degree temperature for 5 days, that's a lot different. So we want to capture that difference. So if you have 75-degree temperature for 5 days, a lot less insect activity happens compared to that 95-degree Fahrenheit days or 5 days of that nature. So essentially the degree day basically is the measurement of the heat units over time and calculated based on daily maximum and minimum temperature. And it's also calculated based on the insect activity, whether they usually have the upper and lower threshold temperature. That means that below that lower threshold insect activity doesn't happen, and upper threshold is the insect activity is going to increase up to that upper level of the activity of the temperature. So we use these heat units as a degree day as a plus the monitoring tool as a kind of combined concept to monitor insect activity out there in the field. For example, in this graph, it's just a kind of representative from navel orangeome. So you see that I mentioned that here in the very first, you see the egg counts that's based on the trap on the black color line. That's what you're seeing. The red color line, as you see, is the degree day accumulation. On the g-axis, as you see in red color. So it gives us idea that when the insect starts at 100-degree days, there is time to spray for that particular insect. So if you put the traps out, if you start accumulating the heat units once the activity started on that trap, then you know how long after that you need to prepare for the spray. For the second generations and third generation, you go by that. It's 1200-degree day. That's for the another spray timing. So if you so the degree day helps us to keep that in timing relevant. If you go by the days, 30 days, again, as I mentioned earlier, 30 days with lower temperature versus the 30 days with the higher temperature hot in the summer in August is different. So that's why we use these combined together to make management decisions. So that's a utility of the, that's a kind of practice of IPM, right? So we're using trap, we're using degree day model, we're making decision based on that. Okay, so so far I talked about the monitoring tools, different kinds of traps, degree days. We can combine these two and make decision to do some kind of control or the management tactics, what we need to adopt, that type of thing. But what are those options in there? That's what we'll talk next in this slide, as you see in here. Also, the IPM prioritized some of these cultural practices, mechanical and physical, biological, other different practices that are out there and that are effective, that are relevant. Not all the times, all the practices can be used for all the pests, of course. But at the same time, if there are those options available, we wanted to use those options because that helps to not getting into the pesticide part, right? So, the cost involved and other things. So the IPM always kind of envision that we want to use more cultural practices, other these practices, and go up and up to the chemical practices, as you see here. As you go up and up, the toxicity level increase in a sense that we're using the insecticide as a kind of last resort of pest management. Again, it's a part of the management program. So you still use it, you have to use it, you might need to use it, but as a sort of like a last resort. On the cultural practices, what I mean by that, right? So there are various things that we can talk about in this, and different insect, different cropping system is different. But in general, if you think about, when you think about planting the crop, when you think about, whether there will be the disease or pest will be prevalent in this area versus, somewhere else if you want to do it. Those kind of things, if you do the cultural practices, for example, sanitizing the orchard, for example, in spotted Drosophila, it's a maggot, it's a fly that lays inside the cherry fruit, and then it's caused damage inside the fruit. But if you sanitize the orchard regular basis, not so much on cherry, but also the other smaller, but more on the smaller fruit like a raspberry, blueberries, on those bushes, if you clean those orchard, after the every harvest, you'll reduce the spotting the Drosophila population. So this is one of the kind of way to do the cultural practices. I'll talk about the winter centison and other things and later. Mechanical practices, pruning. Some cases, the prune out the infested branches help to reduce the population. One good example that I'm working on is the insect that feed on and cause damage on the walnut branches, and it basically that a small branch will die after that infestation happened. So if you know that infestation there, you can cut that part out in the winter time where the larva is still inside the wood at that time. So basically get rid of that branch or that twig, and then you also reduce that population. That's a good example of mechanical or physical control. Biological, we know ladybugs, we know the lacewings, and we know the different kinds of beetles and other predators, praying mantis and other parasites, insect pathogens. These are all the part of the natural enemies. They are always acting in any ecosystem, and then they also help to reduce the population. So we need to think about how we can manage the crop without much disrupting their natural enemies population. So at the end of the day, if you are not even seeing the natural enemies in a regular basis, but they are doing their job in the background, reduce the population of that pest. So we need to kind of think about how we can manage these pests in that way. Behavioral control, I put the mating disruption here, and attract and kill, sterilize insect technique. I won't have time to go in detail on that, but I'll talk about mating disruption a little later in here. But the idea is that if you can use something that modify, or you basically exploit the behavior of the insect, and then use your benefit, that would be something that is behavioral control. For example, if you use some kind of lure, attract the insect, and then put the insecticide on that small attractant part, attract and kill. That's the part of the behavioral control, because you're basically attracting the insect based on behavior to something, and then that insect will be basically attracted to there, and then will be killed. Chemical insecticide, there are different kinds. There are softer chemistry, there are reduced risk, there are specific to certain insect, more selective, versus some are broad spectrum. All are kind of insecticides and fungicides and herbicide, bactericide, all comes in there. So we need to think about what kind of even insecticide, if we choose, would be much more effective for that particular pest, but not so much impacting the natural enemies population out there, that type of thing. So these are all the part of the understanding how that system work, how that the insect and its natural enemies, and what are other options out there, and utilizing all those information to make a decision is essentially IPM. So in some form, we're California, in a lot of crops that we know that we know we're rich in agriculture, right? So we have a lot of different crops in different areas, and our about 50 billion of the total ag commodity output that we produce from California. So that's a lot of contribution from ag to the state. And so in that case, some form of these IPM practices that I mentioned we're using in these different crop and cropping system. Again, every cropping system is different. Every insect is different. Every year could be different in some respect, but we're utilizing these tools and tactics and information to make management decision. I come back to the same kind of pyramid that you showed, I showed before, but I'm going to give an example of how we're using the IPM in navel orangeworm management. So navel orangeworm is a moth, as you see, adult, and then the larva is basically feed on the nut meat of these almonds, walnuts, and pistachio. All three nut crops, these navel orangeworm feed on the nut meat. It is in fact the major pest out of the, a lot of pests that we deal with. It's a major one. It's causing damage. Not only it's directly feeding on the nut meat, but also it causes direct damage that way. But also when they feed on there, they create the environment that is favorable for another mold fungus, aspergillus fungus. That fungus will come and colonize that nut, and that fungus also produces the aflatoxin. It's a toxin that we know that has a carcinogenic effect. So it's not only directly feeding on the nut to cause the direct damage, but also there is a risk of this aflatoxin contamination on this crop after the harvesting. So it's a very critical pest in that regard. So these moth and this larval stage of this moth is basically over winter. They stay inside these nuts that are still on the tree after the harvest. When they shake the trees, a majority of the nuts will fall off, but there are still few nuts left on the trees. Those are the nuts that they utilize to survive as a larval stage throughout that winter. So they're overwintering in there. And in the spring it starts, and then these larvae will change into the pupa, and then the adult emerge, and then they will start flying and just continue doing the different generations. So you see an example, the feeding damage on the almonds, and then down below it's in the walnuts. The same kind of damage they do in pistachio also. So this is kind of cycle of the infestation cycle. These moths that I mentioned, they came out from these mummy nuts in the springtime. They come out and they lay eggs on those mummies again, going back to those mummy nuts. They're not going to infest that fresh nuts at that time in the first generation, that in the springtime. But instead they're going and laying eggs on those mummies again, and then that generation pass. The other generations after that, second to fourth generation, is the ones that goes directly into the fresh nuts and causing damage. Because for the navel orangeworm in order to infest on the nut, they need some kind of avenue split. For example, if the nut starts splitting in July, in these nuts, that's the perfect time for these navel orangeworm second generation coming out and laying eggs there and cause direct damage. So as you see, there is implication of these mummy nuts having on the tree, that they will not only provide the resource for this larva, but also provide the resource for this adult moth for that to survive that whole first generations before these nuts are ready at hull split time in July. So in general, navel orangeworm, again, the utility of the trap. As you see, these are the male moth captured in those pheromone trap. And as I mentioned, this first flight, these are the ones that complete their generation in the mummy nuts. So these basically recycle those mummies and complete their life cycle there. Second through fourth flight is these are the kind of number as you see. As you see, the third and fourth flight, their number is going up and up like that. So this kind of general scenario of how these insect population look like, that helps to manage these insects. So that's the utility of these monitoring tools and having those in there. I'm not spending too much time on this, but the importance of why we need to use the IPM for navel orangeworm. Navel orangeworm, very opportunistic pest. As you see, that its name is navel orange worm. So it started infesting navel oranges that has some level of infection from the disease or some kind of split, and then they start infesting on those in the beginning when the navel orangeum started in California, Arizona in 1920s. But later they changed their host pattern, and now they become a major pest of nut crops. They even, we never hear about navel orange infestation in navel oranges anymore. So it's more problem for nut crops. They're highly temperature dependent. There are multiple generations. They can, come and basically complete one generation and then they go back to the next host plant if they find host crop, complete another generation. Even within the host, they can complete generation. So that is problem. If you have multiple generation, as you go the generations, the number will be higher and higher. Also, it's a very prolific organism. The female produce 300, 400 eggs, and then if the larvae survive, even the small percentage, that would be a lot numbers, and then so number game, right? So if you have more per numbers, more damage you expect. Well adapted to the various environmental conditions. As you see, the one example is they can complete their whole 1 year life, one generation life cycle in those mummy nuts. And if you think about mummy nuts, the quality of those nuts are not very good as compared to fresh nut, but still they will be able to utilize into it. Also, having more than 2 million acres of nut crops in the valley certainly helps navel orangeum to build their population and doing damage. So it's also highly mobile pest. So it is, if you put this all together, it's very difficult pest to predict and then do management. So that's why we need to use the integrated approach where we have the monitoring tools available. We use the winter sanitation, early harvest, and different tactics to manage this pest. I'll talk a little bit more about those. So part of the monitoring is basically, I'm not going to spend too much time on here, but we have various different kinds of tool that we can use to track not only the moth, but also the egg laying behavior of the female. Also, we can, if we do the harvest time sample, we'll be able to figure out how much percent of damage that we have in the field or growers have in the field. There are a lot of different tools that we can use, and multiple tools and tactics that we recommend to use to effectively manage this pest. So this is one of the example of the different kinds of tools are applicable in different areas. For example, if we have the pheromone dispenser mating disruption in the orchard, we'll use one kind of lure versus the without mating disruption, other kinds of lure. I'll talk about mating disruption a little later, so you'll have a little better idea. But the idea is that once you have this pest, then you have multiple tools to use it as a monitoring tools. Another good practice, cultural practice, is doing the winter sanitation. That's we call the foundation of navel orangeum management. And for the very reason that I described, they survive these larvae on these mummy nuts. Up to 7 larvae can survive in one mummy nut. So they utilize that resource. And our recommendation is that if you the winter time going out in the field and then checking these almond orchard again one more time, get rid of all these mummy nuts in the winter time, and then basically destroy them before the flight begin in mid-March. So they have the threshold value, as you see, we talked about that in almonds, and how many mummy nuts is okay to have in those trees per tree basis, and that kind of things are valuable information to have for the control. The other tool we have is we call the early harvest. So the idea for the early harvest is in one of the cultural practice is that, as you see in the figure, if we have the second flight is already come in, and if we're ready to harvest the nuts before that third flight come in, if we're able to harvest that nuts before third flight come in, basically you are preventing those additional moth coming and doing a damage. So essentially the idea is simple. Sometimes it's not that simple in terms of implementing in the field. We need to think about whether nuts are ready or not. You know, you have the equipment that you can go in and check right, you know, right before that flight. All that kind of things are make difference, but that's the tool that routinely we're using and encouraging to be used by growers. Next few minutes, I want to talk about these new tools called the mating disruption. It's a behavioral insect control method. It's a green method. It doesn't involve insecticide, just in that particular method. It's basically the idea for this mating disruption is that, you know, name itself kind of clarifies that the female navel orangeum produces the pheromone. That pheromone plume is followed by the male and mating occurs. And then, you know, have the eggs and a larva and etc. But if the idea for mating disruption is this: if you put these pheromones saturated in the orchard, then that male moth would not be able to find that female because the pheromone is everywhere. They're basically overwhelmed with the pheromone amount in the orchard. They will not be find the female, no eggs, no progeny, and like that. So that's the idea that we, you know, scientists are kind of exploited and use as a control method, and we're successfully using that in nut crops. These are the kind of commercial products out there. They have these pheromone, as you see on this canister. Inside the canister, they have the pheromone, and then they have this device. They puff pheromone at nighttime when the insect activity occurs, moth, especially navel orangeum. They puff out this pheromone every certain interval, saturate that orchard, and that disrupt the mating behavior. There are different kinds. As you see, that these are the puffer kind, aerosol kind of dispenser. The first three, the last one is passive dispenser. Put it into the orchard and you forget about it. It's just releasing the pheromone all the time. We have the work that my colleague David Haviland down in Kern County, UC Cooperative Extension, done work comparing these 4 products. And essentially these 4 products are basically doing a good job in reducing the navel orangeum pressure as compared to untreated control based on Heath's trial in there. We also did collaborative work in Northern San Joaquin Valley as well as South. I work in Northern San Joaquin Valley part, 3 sites. We're looking at with mating disrupted orchard, without mating disruption in the orchard, and looking at different, you know, in there. So these are the 3 sites that I had in here. So essentially what we found was, one thing that we need to think about mating disruption is that when you have mating disruption going into the orchard, that means that that male is not finding the female. That means that that male should not also find your trap that you put in there, because the male moth is attracted to the trap because of the pheromone on that lure, on that particular trap. So if you are seeing the trap shut down, that is the indicator of the pheromone that we're utilizing as a control method is working. So in that case, we see overall 95% reduction in the moth captured on those pheromone trap when we put the trap out in mating disrupted block. So that's a success. The other thing that we see is the reduction in damage is about 46 to 48% overall. So when you use the mating disruption and plus other winter sanitation and other insecticide, other control practice together, you'll be able to bring your percent damage from 4 to 2% by navel orangeum. So that's a pretty good success. And if you think about mating disruption, it's a green product. It doesn't have any side effect to the human, to the environment. Essentially can be used throughout the season if you apply in the very early part of the season, and it provides a benefit to the grower and cost-effective way to reduce the navel orangeum damage is this one. Of course, there are different caveat on that. You've done this too with the control method. You need to know what kind of product you're using. You need to know what's the size and shape of the orchard and different factors in there. Also, when this is essentially a population reduction method, so you want to use early in the spring and then continue that throughout the season. So you're basically disrupting all these generations that is coming. as I mentioned, there are a lot of factors that can influence mating disruption. So you need to understand those before you using the mating disruption. But majority of the cases, PCAs and growers are aware of those and then utilize based on understanding of those. The idea for mating disruption is that not only small one block, but if you use the multiple block, like a bigger block in an area wide or a neighborhood wide approach, then that would be much more effective for including these products. As you see, in a lot of almond acreage here, so if you use all together, that would be a win-win for everyone. Insecticide is also part of this. Of course, we want to use the insecticide as a last resort, and we use that 1 or 2 times in the season. I'm not going to talk too much about this because of the time limitation. So in essence, for IPM practice, we put the traps out. We use the mating disruption. Sorry, without the mating disruption, we use the trap out. With mating disruption, we put the mating disruption out there. We have 2 insecticides, 1 to 2 insecticides later in the season. You use the monitoring tools. You use the removing these mummy nuts at the early part of the season. So if you combine all of these together, it becomes the IPM practice for naval worm management. And the idea for mating disruption utilization is that you gradually reduce the population of these orchard, and hopefully in the future you'll be able to reduce the number of sprays. So far, our recommendation is use mating disruption in addition to all the tools that we're using so far. So with that, I would like to acknowledge a lot of people that contributed in this research and a lot of slides and things, and of course the place where we do the research is of course the growers field, consultant, pest control advisors, industry support. We appreciate all of that, and my technical staff. With that, I would like to thank you for your attention, and I'll just draw your attention quickly in here that we're talking about naval worm IPM management, or IPM management so far with those 4 principles: identify the pest, monitoring economic threshold, and use the control tactics. But my colleague Surendra Dara, he's published a new model of IPM where that with the changing world, changing environment, we just need to think about not only those principles, but also about the consumer perception, about the seller, what kind of product they want, or the producer, what kind of practices they want, and environmental safety and social responsibility. All that kind of factors together brings IPM in a basically in the next level. So this is a kind of newer discussion, newer thing that we're talking about. And so this is a great model. So if you want to have a look at it, you can search, and you have the information there in the slide as well for that paper. So with that, I would like to thank again to the organizer, and happy to take any questions if any of the audience have.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. A lot of great information packed in there. I know you probably had more that you could have went on about, but I mean, we appreciate you spending some time here today. And I know Dr. McInnes has got some questions. I saw some people were posting some questions in the chat. So I'm going to let her ask you a couple of questions. And then if anybody else has any questions, if you want to list it in the chat on the YouTube, she will kind of pass those questions on.
Hi. Yeah, we do. We have a couple. Oh, I don't know if you guys can hear me. Hopefully you can. It's not highlighting me on Zoom right now. Okay. So we have a couple questions in the chat. The first one: how big of a problem is monoculture in helping to control pests? Do you think encouraging polyculture would be beneficial in pest mitigation?
Can you repeat the first part again? Sorry.
How big of a problem is monoculture in helping to control pests?
Yeah. Well, that's a great question. I mean, there is always, benefit and, positive and negative side of things. for example, if you have the monoculture, you're likely to have the same kind of insect and generations that you're kind of building. And then also because of the crop there, and then the insect pests are more adapted to that environment, and you likely have more and more problem. But at the same time, in a commercial agriculture, you would think about the economic value that bring these commercial monoculture system. That also the thing that we don't want to deny, because, for example, in almond industry, it's about 80% of the world's almond we produce in California here. So if we don't have the monoculture, then we won't be able to supply that. So it's always a balance. But I completely agree with that question, that if you have polyculture, if you have a lot of different cropping system out there, that would be much more supportive for different kinds of natural enemies and things. It all depends on the what crop you're talking about, and what are the pests and what are natural enemies complex out there, and whether we can economically, deal with that with the polyculture, or in that matter, even with the monoculture. So it's a sort of like a balancing act. And not every insect has all the natural enemies out there, and we can utilize it. Some are effective, others are not. Some are effective to a certain extent, others are not. So we kind of need to think about that way too. But it's a really good thought.
Awesome. We have another one. This one's from Emily Lee. Do you breed, protect certain insects if they are going extinct, especially if they are important, like bees who are affected by pesticides, like how we try to protect keystone species in a food web?
Definitely. I think the answer is yes. We try to, that's why I think we're trying to do the IPM approach. It's an ecosystem-based approach. We don't want to harm the beneficial, or the bees or pollinator. Those are our friends. Without the pollinator, right, especially in the almond country, that we don't survive, or the almond growers won't survive without pollinators, right? So we do have that responsibility. And because of that, I think it's, there is always more work to do, but because of that, almond industry came up. And then that right now, that in the bee flying season in the February, that we don't recommend to use any insecticide during the bloom time to protect the bees. Of course, there are always avenues to improve and then do that. But yeah, I totally agree. It's a more ecosystem-based approach. So you want to save and protect some of the species and pollinators and beneficial and natural enemies out there. And at the same time, to get the economic benefit of that crop provides, and also from that economic, from the service that provided by the pollinators too. So yeah, I guess it's a balancing act. And so we need to kind of think about the ways that we can manage this pest, not kill the pest. So that's why we come up with a kind of newer and tactics and ideas that potentially work and do the less harm to the non-targets.
Thank you so much. It looks like those are our questions. There were a few questions that people answered. I'll just get your feedback on this one. Why is the mummy nut called the mummy nut?
Well, to be honest, I don't know the exact answer. I think it's I mean, these are the nuts that are from the last year. That's a very good question that got me right. So these are the mummy nuts that I guess it's to try to scare people. I don't know, to be honest, to the right answer. But if you have the nuts from the last year, that's kind of look like in the tree in the winter time, they're just like black nuts on the tree. I don't know answer. Maybe some of the audience, I'm sure they know the answer, but I also need to explore and find out why it's called mummy nuts. Yeah.
That's great. Thank you so much for being with us today. Troy, do you have any last comments?
Hey, I just want to thank Dr. Rijal for being our first out of the gate guest speaker this semester. I mean, that's you don't know how much we appreciate it. It's great for you to spend this time, and what a great topic to kind of start off with here. And then we also, everybody that's out there, we still got 45 people watching. Everybody needs to thank Dr. Liz McGinnis for putting this together. This has been a lot of hard work behind the scenes getting this going. So again, thank you very much, Liz. We appreciate it.
Yeah, well, thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me. I really enjoyed it. And I know that, you know, for some audience, it could be a little more much information than needed. But say at the same time, there might be some practitioner out there that, you know, utilize some of the information. So if any questions that audience might have, I'll be happy to take those, you know, by email or, you know, phone calls. And definitely I'll, you know, like to, you know, kind of engage this kind of conversation in the future too. So thank you for the invitation.
Excellent. Do you mind if we leave this up for the next couple of days?
Oh yeah, you totally, it's fine. Yeah. So you
Okay.
mean like a video?
Yep.
Yep.
Actually, I was going to ask you, we might keep it up indefinitely on our channel if that's okay with you, and I'll send you the link.
I think so. Yeah, I think so. I don't mind it. Yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna edit kind of our beginning, getting going stuff off the front, and and I'll send you the link. And if there's anything there that you want to edit out or change, let me know. No problem.
We do. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Thanks everyone for joining us. Have a great day. We will see you on October 21st.
Okay. Thank you. Good evening.
Bye.
Have a good evening.
Bye.